At the outset, I must confess that when Bar-Ilan's Department of Jewish Philosophy first asked me to speak precisely on this evening's topic, the invitation struck me as an ironic coming to full circle, sprinkled with more than a smidget of poetic justice. The reason for this begins about 25 years ago, when a colleague of mine who's sitting here in this room sent me an anthology of essays entitled Feminist Perspectives on Jewish Studies, edited by Lynn Davidman and Shelley Tenenbaum. This was perhaps the first serious attempt to assess the impact of the gender component on Jewish studies. In sending me this volume, my friend sought to draw my attention particularly to the chapter devoted to Jewish philosophy, in which the author, Chava Tirosh Rothschild, notes with regret that even amongst the small number of female scholars who have entered this area of research, all continue to play on the conventional male home field without developing a distinctive feminist discourse of their own. I remember feeling surprised and flattered at the time that my name was included in the august shortlist of female Jewish philosophers contributing to the field. But other than that, I honestly hadn't a clue as to what she was after. Since then, of course, much water has flown under the bridge. So here I am now seeking to convince you that the Feminist Revolution, possibly the most significant innovation of Western liberalism in modern times, has not only transformed many significant facets of contemporary Jewish life on the practical plane. More specifically, I want to talk about the effect that a feminist perspective has had on academia at large and on Jewish thought in particular. On surface, the relevance of feminism to academia isn't entirely obvious. Academic research has long been regarded by many as a neutral scholarly project, ideally free of any practical agenda. Feminism, on the other hand, is usually taken to be a movement belonging to the world of action, prescriptive rather than descriptive, directed towards what ought to be rather than what is. This is not to say that all feminist scholars go along with this strict division of labor. As a matter of fact, when a suggestion was raised by the programming committee of Bar-Ilan's gender department that 4 weekly hours of fieldwork advancing feminist causes should be included in the curricular requirements, it was actually me who constituted a minority of one against the proposal. On that occasion, I tried to argue that just as we would quite rightly rule out participation in demonstrations against Israeli disengagement of the Gaza Strip as a valid requirement of students in a course devoted to religious Zionist settler ideology in the Department of Jewish Philosophy, so too should the study of feminist theory be open to any student, no matter what their degree of identification with the practical or political aims of this movement. My colleagues agreed regarding Jewish thought, but felt that gender studies somehow were different. Be this as it may, rejecting the necessity for straightforward identification of scholars with the political ramifications of their area of research doesn't prevent acknowledging the importance of feminism to Jewish thought on a far more profound level, and its potential for radically transforming the way we approach academia at large. In this sense, feminism should be viewed as both a catalyst and product of a more general revolution to the way we function as knowers and scholars in a postmodern age. Typifying modernism was commitment to Enlightenment claims regarding the universality of pure reason. This led to a general attempt to approach the objects of our research objectively, neutralizing any accompanying personal biases or interests. Postmodern discourse, by contrast, recognizes the inevitable partiality of all knowledge. It accepts that the meaning of texts, as all other cultural artifacts, does not simply reside within these as such, but is rather created through the interaction between the material to be examined, its examiners, and the broader context in which this interaction takes place. The feminist contribution to this view is simply its emphasis on the key role that gender plays in this process. Contemporary feminists may differ regarding the degree to which women's distinctiveness and unique ways of knowing is inbuilt and essential or socially constructed, and whether it ought to supplement prevailing male conceptions of truth in some androgynous model, or, as some radical feminists suggest, override them completely. Nevertheless, all agree that the feminine perspective has something valuable to contribute, challenging prevailing male conceptions of truth as the irreducible, self-evident, and exclusive prism of reality. The transformation that feminist consciousness has imposed on academic scholarship, particularly in the humanities and social sciences, involves both critical and constructive aspects. On the critical level, the first step was to remove women's invisibility as both producers and subjects of knowledge. Beyond promoting the professional advancement of female scholars and including the works of women in course syllabi, this meant documenting whatever evidence could be found regarding women's relevance in the field, to the field in question. At first, this attempt was conducted by studying women's lives, experiences, and cultural productivity according to the categories of traditional male scholarship. In other words, women's achievements were assessed according to male standards and in light of typically male pursuits. Eventually, however, it was understood that relying on these concepts and theoretical frameworks simply perpetuates women's invisibility. In assuming that the prevailing division of gender roles is correct and natural, and basing research on questions that were originally formulated only by men, scholars often missed much of what was distinctive about women's experiences. Eventually, feminists began to understand that correcting the invisibility of women was not simply, as Chava Tirosh expressed it, a matter of add women and stir. Making room for women's standpoint and ways of knowing affects the qualitative nature of this knowledge as well. Viewing research from a feminist perspective influences the way that scholars define their subject matter, what questions should be asked, and how the information that is elicited should be interpreted and applied. This also bears methodological implications, such as attaching greater prominence to qualitative interviews and personal narratives rather than faceless statistics. The feminist revolution in academia did not bypass Jewish studies and has actually influenced most of its subfields dramatically. Thus, for example, in the study of Jewish history, female scholars have for several decades been exploring what was her story rather than his story. As a result, new topics of inquiry, such as the role of family or concepts of love and friendship in different eras, are now accepted as legitimate objects of research. Biblical and rabbinic studies, modern Jewish and Hebrew literature, political science, sociology, anthropology, ethnography, Holocaust studies, Israel studies, filmmaking, and the arts have all been similarly affected. Using gender as a central analytic category for the study of Jewish life has led to a reconceptualizing of basic concepts and to paradigm shifts that extend across disciplines as well. Turning specifically to the realm of Jewish philosophy, however, the situation differs somewhat. In the article I mentioned earlier, in which Chava Tirosh Rothschild laments the sorry state of feminist influence on Jewish philosophy, she also offers three possible factors that might explain why this discipline has lagged behind other subfields of Jewish studies in this respect. Firstly, the fact that Western philosophy bears no tradition of women engaged in the field. Secondly, that this tradition has explicitly devalued women as inferior. Thirdly, and most importantly, that this variety of philosophy has typically understood itself as seeking universally valid knowledge of an objective reality, focusing on the human condition at large. Therefore, it was committed in principle to disregarding the particular circumstances of the knower, such as her religion or gender. Transferring these challenges to the Jewish field merely compounds these obstacles. The third factor in particular is complicated by fundamental debates among Jewish philosophers regarding the nature, scope, and purpose of their field and its intended audience. Whether purporting to rely on the objectivity of historical facts or on the somewhat murkier waters of philosophical reflection, applying strictly universal standards to a field that is partial from the outset in its commitment to Jewish interests is problematic. Introducing feminist sensibilities as an added prism simply intensifies the futility of any pretensions to neutrality. This is not to say that the conversation between feminism, philosophy, and Judaism is an impossible project or of dubious value, especially if we include within its purview some broader interdisciplinary research that has so far been conducted under the rubric of gender studies or departments of religion and theology. The situation was never so dismal or marginal as Tirosh Samuelson pictures. Moreover, as the impact of these related fields upon more purist definitions of Jewish philosophy continues to grow, the addition of a feminist perspective is slowly transforming the field. Instead of being conceived as a discipline engaged in disinterested pursuit of knowledge for its own sake, a sizable chunk of Jewish thought is now driven by women's urge to resolve concrete issues that they face with regard to Judaism's central beliefs and practices. The seeds of this more practical type of confrontation between Judaism, feminism, and philosophy were first strewn in the 1960s, when several liberally inclined Jewish women, such as Betty Friedan and Gloria Steinem, joined what has come to be known as the second wave of American feminism. Initially, these women, well-educated, but not necessarily in Jewish terms, didn't link their activity to their religious or ethnic identities. But this started changing a decade later when some such women began to connect their sense of discrimination and lack of equal opportunity to their standing in Jewish tradition, questioning the glorification of their roles as wives and mothers, their subordinate status in Jewish law, their lack of direct representation in Judaism's canonic texts, their exclusion from religious leadership, and active participation in the public domain, and so on. Developments in Jewish thought that emerged in the wake of this first stage of discontent have, as a rule, traversed the same path as that of feminist theory in Western society at large. Because the division of society by gender is such a fundamental component in this construction of Jewish tradition, the initial project of Jewish feminists was to reveal the extent to which sexism and the normative status of male authority underlie core assumptions of Jewish theology and practice and are embedded in the very grammar of the Hebrew language. The Torah addresses the male as the representative Jew. In later texts, the role and value of women is, as a rule, defined and limited even further by male interests and considerations. Women are not the intended audience, and their experiences do not figure as a central topic worthy of discussion. In sum, traditional Jewish sources are the record of males looking out upon women as other, reflecting male conceptualizations of women rather than flowing naturally from women's own self-understanding. Surveying responses to this critique is complicated because of the great denominational diversity characterizing Judaism in modern times. Outside the mainstream, there have been marginal attempts to dabble in neo-pagan pre-biblical goddess theology or post-monotheistic spiritualism. Most Jewish feminists, however, have chosen not to break completely with their normative monotheistic heritage. Differences between Reform, Reconstructionist, Conservative, Modern Orthodox, and Ultra-Orthodox or Haredi Judaism in accommodating the feminist critique are generally linked to ideological divisions regarding the divinity of the Torah, the immutability of halakha, and the relative importance of each to religious life. Haredi Jews, who equate acceptance of traditional norms with submission to God's eternal will, generally regard feminism as an intrusive movement foreign to Judaism that creates disturbing tension, if not downright conflict, with hallowed beliefs and practices. To the extent that this type of opposition has provoked philosophical response, it typically consists of arguments appealing to essentialist views of gender or to other culturally and politically benign features of patriarchy that might justify male hegemony. Among those who remain unconvinced, some more liberally inclined feminists have chosen to rely on selective appropriation of egalitarian motifs that already do exist in Jewish tradition, dismissing the rest as merely the negative influence of passive, extraneous sociological forces. This has led to scholarly efforts at what I term historical restorativism. In other words, engaging in revisionist history in order to unearth evidence of more egalitarian practices of Judaism before its ideal standards became sellified. After the fashion of several noted Christian feminists, this approach has also encouraged developing new, more sophisticated exegetical methods in order to mine classical Jewish texts for precedents of women's inclusion or hidden hints of protest against their subordination and privileging whatever interpretation gives the text the benefit of the doubt. Such efforts, which strive to afford contemporary women full equality in matters of ritual practice, communal authority, and opportunity for religious leadership in accordance with what is normally extended to men, align with what is generally regarded as second stage feminism. In other words, they aim to provide women with an equal share in the male pie. A third, more radical stage of Jewish feminist thought contends that theology, rather than sociology, lies at the heart of the problem. Feminists adopting this stance are persuaded by internal connections that critics claim to have revealed between the monotheistic conception of God and male ways of thinking. To the extent that monotheism places men at the center, they argue, the world it constructs to make sense of human experience is also a world imbued with a male perspective. The entire shape of the religion, its basic paradigms and perceptions of reality are especially suited to the male psyche, reflecting the hopes, needs, and fears of men living in a patriarchal framework. Picturing an infinite God in exclusively male terms, according to this line of thought, is simply another form of idolatry. Moreover, binding worship to male-oriented conceptions of transcendence and to hierarchies of authority, dominion, and control leads to marginalizing female forms of spirituality, which typically favor more spontaneous demonstrations of connectedness, intimacy, mercy, and love. Perhaps the most damning allegation raised in this context is the pernicious influence that the monotheistic notion of God exerts upon relations between men and women on the anthropological level. Third stage feminists point out that religion does not merely create a certain social pattern, it also represents and reifies it, and thereby grants it legitimacy. Students of Jewish thought, persuaded by this level of critique, but still reluctant to part with their cultural identity as Jews, seek bolder forms of revisionism that can infuse the patriarchal formulae of tradition with softer feminine models. This includes scholarly efforts which might support the introduction of female imagery to the language of prayer, new woman-friendly rituals, and even new historical narratives designed to supplement and shape spaces empty of women in the Jewish collective memory. Despite its ultimately androcentric character, the mystic tradition of medieval Kabbalah and its later Hasidic offshoots, which feature a theosophy of embodied spirituality, rich feminine imagery of the Shekhinah, and notions of reciprocal influences between the human and the divine, serve as an important resource for the revisionist project, as verified by the disproportionately high percentage of women scholars now engaged in this area of Jewish research. More rationally inclined female scholars continue to focus upon medieval and modern Jewish thinkers who conform to narrower conceptions of definitions of philosophy as commitment to the universal reason. But when viewed through a gendered lens, even the parameters of this old-style notion of Jewish philosophy, which focused in the past on logocentric discussion of religious dogma, proof of God's existence, unity, providence, free will, prophecy, and the like, now extend to new topics of inquiry. On the one hand, critical analysis of the degree to which Jewish thinkers such as the Rambam have adopted the gendered language of Aristotelian metaphysics that equates man with the constancy of form and woman with the fickleness of matter, forces us to rethink the relationship between philosophy and rhetoric. On the other hand, investigation of Jewish views of desire, eco-theology, embodied knowledge, and similar shifts in focus reflect fresh sensitivity to the role of emotion, intuition, and this worldly experience in the cognitive process, and to women's prioritizing of interconnective relations over guarding of boundaries. Even philosophers who view their scholarly task in purely historiographic terms are now revealing that any historical survey is also a political act. Thus, for example, the rise of importance granted to thinkers such as Levinas, Buber, Heschel may be attributed in part to a rising inclination to replace traditional notions of worship as obligation and subjugation to heteronomous command with a more feminine ethic of caring, highlighting the importance of confronting the other as a primary tool for religious engagement. A related issue raised by third stage feminism is the extent to which Judaism's appropriation of halakha as the standard medium for religious expression is the product of male ways of thinking. Judith Plasko, an influential feminist theologian associated with the Reform movement, acknowledges the fact that law constitutes an important part of Jewish teaching, but questions its suitability considering the feminine preference for more fluid forms of spirituality. She has also voiced doubt regarding halakhic potential for remedying women's status and tradition because of its systemic view of woman as other. As against this skepticism, Rachel Adler, also associated with the Reform movement, places a greater premium on halakha as a necessary tool for preserving Jewish identity, but seeks proactive measures for breaking out of its authoritarian model as a closed system of obsolete and unjust rules. For the purposes of our discussion, I want to suffice with this sketchy account of conservative, liberal, and radical Jewish responses to the feminist critique, and focus the rest of my remarks on related developments within modern Orthodox Judaism. Not only because this is the community with which I am most familiar, but also because I believe that women who self-identify with this faction experience the highest degree of tension between their religious loyalties and the egalitarian reality of their secular lives. Precisely because modern Orthodoxy professes ideological commitment to the Torah as a divine document and to the entire body of oral law as normative and binding, alongside engagement with secular culture as a positive value, the intensity of the challenge that this variety of Judaism faces in the conflict between Jewish demands for continuity and feminist conceptions of justice brings the stakes involved into greatest relief. But especially in its Israeli manifestations, I believe that modern Orthodox feminism, colored as it is by its own distinctive timing and socio-political setting, also currently serves as a hotbed for some of the most sophisticated and constructive contributions to Jewish thought to date. In true feminist fashion, I won't attempt to defend these contentions from some detached view from nowhere. Rather, I will speak from my own personal experience as a modern Orthodox woman living in the state of Israel, who has been engaged in nearly a lifetime of study in the study and practice of Jewish philosophy. Growing up in this environment, I certainly experienced occasion for frustration at being excluded from key male opportunities for learning and spiritual activity. My very choice to enter the field of Jewish thought was largely determined by the fact that I'm a woman. Arriving in Israel as a teenage immigrant, I hoped to enrich my Jewish background by taking courses in that area in which the Hebrew University most prided itself, Jewish studies. Had I been a male, my religious interest in advancing my Jewish literacy would most likely have led me to a yeshiva or to the university's Talmud department. But because these avenues were not open to me at the time, I turned instead to what was then a less exclusively male discipline, Jewish philosophy. This already meant that my interest in Jewish philosophy was not strictly academic, in what was then the accepted understanding of the term. Beyond a wish to master this body of thought for its own sake, I was also on a spiritual quest, seeking to reinforce identification with the legacy of Orthodox Judaism, to which I was committed by birth and upbringing. In order to make it my own, I felt the need to somehow translate its tenets and render them intelligible in the more universal terms of a broader philosophical and scientific milieu in which I was also equally immersed. However, it never occurred to me at this stage to relate any personal gripes regarding my restricted halachic status as a woman to my philosophical pursuits. Even as a novice, I was aware of potential clashes between internal and external views of religious doctrine. Nevertheless, my basic trust in both led to a conviction that the two could somehow be reconciled in a manner that would be mutually enriching. Initially, I was also very much affected by the approach of historical positivism that characterized Jewish scholarly research at the time I began my studies. The pride of this approach, which could be categorized as Jewish intellectual history, was its pretensions to freedom from personal bias or ideological interests. In a broader sense, however, this historicism was related to more general notions of truth as grounded in ultimate, indubitable, self-certifying propositions. Truth-seeking consisted, therefore, in the attempt to capture existing predefined verities in the physical or metaphysical world by reaching down to the firm and stable foundations on which they rested. The corroboration of truth claims, be they scientific, historical, philosophical, or theological, was therefore to be conducted on some neutral territory out there and to be judged only in terms of their correspondence to these foundations. As a matter of fact, reliance upon foundationalism was and still is the general approach assumed by most of my Orthodox colleagues engaged in academia, particularly those in the natural sciences, to the extent that they are exposed and troubled by rival truth claims. Such proponents of this approach, generally known as Torah u'Mad'a, typically understand both bodies of thought as vying in the same ballpark in the attempt to capture objective reality. Thus, they conclude, each discipline's truth should be tested and measured by the same standards. In the event of clashes, one rendition must be correct and the other not. In the tradition of Jewish thought, I found much support for the Torah u'Mad'a position. Nevertheless, my exposure to the broader vistas of the social sciences and the humanities, history, archaeology, comparative religion, literary criticism, and the like, eventually raised a host of qualitatively different questions that undermined a foundationalist view of religious truth claims. After partaking of the forbidden fruit of this more comprehensive tree of knowledge, reliance upon a combination of ad hoc localized solutions to an individual problems seemed woefully inadequate to the task of responding to an ever-growing list of difficulties surrounding traditional accounts of the literary genesis of the Torah. The motley collection of patches applied in piecemeal fashion to various holes riddling the religious narrative began to lose their persuasive power when such flaws could be resolved so much more elegantly by one simple naturalistic explanation that left God and metaphysics out of the picture, a solution I was committed to rejecting. Without consciously abandoning the Torah u'Mad'a approach, I found myself increasingly drawn to precedents in Jewish thought that diverged from assumptions of direct correspondence between hard facts and the authoritative truth claims of religion. A chief source of inspiration was the thought of Rav Avram Yitzchak Kook. As opposed to most scholars who focused on the nationalistic and political aspect of his thought, I was initially drawn to other features of his legacy. Firstly, the fact that much of his writing took the form of a personal diary. Later, I was also struck by his rejection of binary thinking, as evident in his qualified attitude towards monotheism and its emphasis upon divine transcendence, his celebration of instinct, immersion in this worldly activity and natural morality as indispensable conduits of spirituality, his ability to recognize the role of historical process in the evolution of religious ideas, and his understanding that the main importance of religious truth statements was not their degree of correspondence with some external reality, but rather their influence on moral flourishing. Years later, I came to appreciate that most of these features are, from a gendered perspective, characteristic of what has come to be associated with feminine ways of thinking. In retrospect, their attraction for me may have already then been prompted by an intuitive sense that such predilections would somehow lead the way to a more comprehensive resolution of the incongruence between claims based on religious authority and those based on reason. But the direct impetus for working out such a resolution explicitly was a byproduct of the dramatic developments in the situation of Orthodox Jewish women that commenced a couple of decades later. When Blue Greenberg, the acknowledged mother of modern Orthodox feminism, came out in 1981 with her groundbreaking book on women in Judaism, I found that many of the issues she raised overlapped with my own. However, her take tended to be phrased in political and sociological rather than theological terms. To the extent that she and other members of JOFA, the Jewish Orthodox Feminist Alliance founded on her initiative, to the extent that they allowed themselves to proceed at all beyond acknowledging the predominantly male perspective of the Torah, they typically limited themselves to gingerly attempts at mitigating perceived injustices or anachronisms of the system on a practical level from within the current boundaries of halakha. In other words, this brand of feminism reached the second stage and went no further. Its unstated assumption was that the Torah may indeed have been phrased in terms of a patriarchal and pagan society, but it is not given to flesh and blood to change at will a tradition that is based upon a divinely inspired document. Living in Israel, where Judaism is the majority culture, and there is no clear division between church and state, limiting responses to conflict between religion and feminist concerns to select normative issues while ignoring their broader theological implications is far more difficult. Perhaps for this reason, the point that I came to appreciate was that over and above considerations of justice or lack of a female perspective in biblical accounts of God, history, and the world at large, it is precisely in its unstated assumption about the nature of the Torah that the real problem of Orthodox feminism lies. In other words, the most troubling aspect of the feminist critique for modern orthodoxy, as I saw it, was the more profound challenge that it posed to the central understanding upon which the authority of Jewish tradition has been based for millennia, that is, the very notion of a divinely revealed text. If the Torah is from God, it should be above any human conditionality. But if the Torah's understanding of self, world, and God so clearly reflect a patriarchal social order, how are we to view the source of such a Torah? Since the perspective of the Torah is so limited, can we really credit it with being divine? Is it really describing God in words that God has revealed to us? Or are these words perhaps merely the projection of our own wishes or social systems onto the cosmos in a religious language that is socially shaped and culture bound and therefore not binding on us? The problem intensifies when we realize that all rabbinic commentary and halachic legislation is based upon the legal and narrative sections of the Torah, which were always regarded by tradition as stemming directly from God and therefore above human conditioning. Admittedly, such questions were raised in limited form even in Talmudic times, and surely apply to many other areas where Jews nowadays feel the time and culture-bound nature of the Torah and later traditional texts. But beyond pointing to any particular scientific, moral, or theological difficulty in the contents of the Torah, the uniqueness of the feminist critique lies in the fact that it highlights an all-pervasive male bias so implicit and subtle that the innocent reader usually remains unaware of its existence. This ultimately drives us to ask, can any verbal message claiming revelatory status really be divine? Because language itself is shaped by the cultural context in which it is formulated and is of necessity bound to a particular standpoint, is a divine and eternally valid message at all possible? Can any verbal message transcend its cultural trappings? With these questions, the clash between orthodoxy and feminism is transformed from a dispute over the facticity of God's revelation at Sinai to a debate over issues of general bias and the ubiquitous traces of cultural relativism. And it is here that the insufficiency of traditional panaceas come into boldest relief. The Baal bias cannot be limited to specific terms or passages. It's all over the text. It thus appeared obvious to me that if the feminist critique in its Jewish context threatens to relativize and conditionalize the entire corpus of traditional halakha, Orthodox Jews stand in desperate need of a contemporary theology that will accommodate the following two requisites. First, the ability to acknowledge with a maximum of intellectual integrity the degree to which the Torah and halakha at large are formulated in a time and culture-bound societal mold. Second, to assert that this same Torah is nevertheless the eternal voice of God speaking to us, with every word of that voice equally holy and indispensable, and even to find theological meaning in the fact that our sacred and revered texts have been bound to the implicit patriarchal premises which feminist thinkers have been uncovering. Relying on elements in the thought of Rav Kook and rabbinic tradition at large, I began developing the idea that it is possible to maintain belief in the divinity of the Torah despite its androcentric bias and other marks of human infant, by breaking down the strict dichotomy between divine speech and natural historic process. My grounding for this approach, which I termed cumulativism, was based on three assumptions. First, if the Torah is to bear a message for all generations, its revelation must be an ongoing process, a dynamic unfolding that reveals its ultimate significance only through time. Second, God's message is not expressed through the reverberation of vocal cords, but rather through rabbinic interpretation of the text, which may or may not be accompanied by evolutionary developments in human understanding, and through the mouthpiece of history. History, and particularly what happens to the Jewish people, the ideas and forms of life they accept, as well as the process of determining those they reject, is essentially another mode of ongoing revelation, a surrogate prophecy. Third, that although successive rabbinic hearings of God's Torah sometimes appear to contradict his original message, that message is never replaced. On a formal level, the original Sinaitic revelation always remains the foundational cultural linguistic filter through which these new deviations are heard and understood. The sanctified formulations of the canonic texts continue to serve as the absolute rock-bottom perimeters of Jewish belief and practice, even though subsequent revelations may totally transform their original import, even turning them on their head. Applying the notion of cumulative revelation to the problem at hand, I suggested that religious believers might regard the rise of feminism in our day, like other phenomena in the past, as a heaven-sent vehicle for the transmission of God's word. Such an understanding does not involve devaluating or supplanting the previous norms of patriarchy, but to the extent that the feminist critique takes hold and informs the life of the halakhically committed traditionalists, they may understand women's quest for equality as an updated expression of the divine will, indicating that we have outgrown earlier and more primitive forms of spirituality and are ready for a new, more sublime stage. Not unexpectedly, my attempt to resolve the theological challenge of feminism by means of this dynamic understanding of revelation received mixed reviews. It was welcomed enthusiastically by many members of the modern Orthodox community and others of a more liberal bent who felt that this approach offered them a way to reconcile deeply felt feminist sensibilities with their religious loyalties. Others regarded the move towards a more open-ended and naturalistic concept of revelation as giving up the traditional game from the outset, since the absolute and context-free character of the Torah has come to be so commonly accepted as the very essence of Orthodox Jewish theology. On the opposite end of the stick, dyed-in-the-wool feminists resisted considering patriarchy as even a temporary manifestation of divine providence or part of a gradual unfolding of divine intent. Viewing the stakes of the argument from these variegated perspectives led me to a second, more radical theological stance. Drawing upon my previous forays into non-foundationalist resources in Jewish and general philosophical thought, the urge to formulate a philosophically viable response induced me to appeal to a genre of postmodern theology that downplays the propositional import of religious doctrine in the life of the believer. According to this view, the primary interest of religious truth statements is not to discuss facts or establish history. Their main function operates on an entirely different plane, reflecting and fortifying a form of life and worldview to which we are inextricably bound by a combination of personal conviction, passion, and practical considerations. While my view of revelation is deliberately fashioned in a manner that can coexist with universal naturalistic understandings, it certainly is not mandated by them. I personally prefer the notion of revelation through history and a non-propositional view of religious truths for a variety of reasons, which I won't go into now. But my interest in introducing these ideas here is not to promote them specifically. Rather, it is to suggest that the contribution of feminism to Jewish thought cannot suffice with addressing parochial issues of Jewish continuity and practice. It also demands confronting appreciation for the inevitability of situated knowledge and diversity of opinion that feminism generates, and responding to this typically postmodern quandary in philosophically rigorous terms that bear universal provenance. The innovations wrought by feminist perspectives in the realm of Jewish thought have just begun. I believe that the debates that these provoke may eventually prove to be the most serious catalyst for rejuvenating Jewish thought in the 21st century. I, for one, look forward with great anticipation to the broader vistas to which the three-way conversation between feminism, Judaism, and philosophy will lead. I hope that I've managed to convince and excite some of you regarding this as well.
Thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, you've just been listening to the public annual M.G. Levine Lecture in Jewish Thought at Bar-Ilan University, delivered this year by our distinguished guest speaker, Professor Tamar. I think if just listening to such radically brave and open-minded thought that it did great honor to this event, the public lecture. And I'm personally very happy about this rare opportunity to hear real theological thought about Judaism, which is really should be done much more. Thank you very, very much. And now I'm trying to opening the stage for questions. I think questions can also be asked in Hebrew, but please, dear participants, try to ask short and precise questions without just going into many lectures yourself. Just please ask your question to Professor Ross, who hope would still be able to answer it, right? Okay, and please raise your hand if there is a question, or use the reaction function of the Zoom to raise your hand so that I can see you. First hand I see, Anael, please.
Hi, good evening, Professor Ross. Thank you so much for your lecture. for the background and for these inspiring thoughts at the end of your speech. My question is very short. For those who are unfamiliar to the idea that the Torah has an essentially male bias in the text, I am this. I read the Torah maybe very traditionally. Could you give an example? Could you teach us? Could you show us how that works, and maybe what we do with this?
Well, first of all, God is pictured as male in gender. He is also a judge and a warrior. He is zealous, various characteristics that are generally revered by men rather than women. For other examples, I'll turn you to my book, chapter 7, I think, and you'll find it explicated much more extensively there.
Thank you.
Lisa.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. A question probably more from ignorance than from anything else, but from anecdotal personal experience, most of the work seems to be coming from the Ashkenazi world. And I was just wondering, is that true? And is there anything coming through from the Edot Mizrach in the same way, who they tend to be more traditional, I think, from that point of view? I just would like to hear your thoughts, if you don't mind.
Well, here in Israel, as of late, the Sephardic and Edot Mizrach tradition is becoming much more active as feminists as well. And the whole issue of Ashkenazi-dominated religious culture is being somewhat questioned by new discussions of traditionalism that is advocated more by the Sephardi community. That's about it.
Are there more questions? Please raise your hand. Okay, Ruben.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for a stimulating lecture. I want to ask a question based on something I've read in the name of Daphne Hampson, who wrote that it seems unlikely that women would have conceived of the relationship to God in terms of law and covenant. I haven't formed a clear picture of the alternative that you suggest to law and covenant. Well, I guess, first of all, do you agree with her assertion that men would not have, that men generated this idea of law and covenant? And does the feminist critique provide an alternative model to law and covenant?
Well, Daphne Hampson, I've read her work with great interest. And I can sympathize to an extent with the notion that law is more congenial, a law-dominated religion may be more congenial to the male mentality, but as feminists themselves understand, or except for those who would really have feminine culture dominate everything, women also need laws. They've not been so far in positions of authority, and so they can afford the luxury of just streaming along with their intuitions. But one needs a balance between the two, and certainly law has been much more of a central requirement in Judaism than in Christianity, and I think for good reason. So I think feminism now is perhaps softening the classical conception of Jewish law by including the mandate to compassion, by emphasizing the tendency of halakha to relegate importance to conciliation and bridging rather than adversarial kinds of positions. But to eliminate law altogether, I think, is out of the question for Judaism and for society at large.
Thank you. The next question, Shachar.
אפשר לשאול בעברית?
כן.
תודה. אז אם הבנתי נכון, מה שקובע, מה שייכנס לשכבה הבאה של ההתגלות המתמדת, זה ההכרה של העם. מה שהעם מחליט לפי הכללים הנתונים שמתאים ייכנס פנימה, מה שלא לא ייכנס. עכשיו, במקרה של פמיניזם זה מורכב, כי קודם כל מי זה העם, כמו שאת אמרת בעצמך בניתוח של התגובות, יש הרבה תגובות שונות, חלקן מאוד רדיקליות לכיוונים השונים, ודבר שני, אני לא חקרתי את זה לעומק, אבל האינטואיציה שלי שבמקרה של פמיניזם הכללים הקיימים לא מספיקים כדי לעשות התאמה מודולרית מותאמת,
לא הבנתי את ההערה האחרונה הזאת.
הכללים הקיימים הפרשניים וההלכתיים, להערכתי, לא מספיקים כדי להכיל את הפמיניזם באופן אורגני בתוך היהדות, ונדרש סוג של מהפכה שהכללים לא יכולים להיענות לה. אולי את לא מסכימה, אני אשמח לשמוע.
מה כוונתך בכללים?
הכללים הפרשניים וההלכתיים הקיימים.
אז אני חושבת שתהליך של תיקון כבר מתחיל בשיתוף נשים בתהליך ההלכתי, וזה מתקדם בצעדים שלא הייתי מאמינה לפני 20 שנה שימשיכו בקצב הזה, ואני חושבת שבאופן טבעי השיתוף בין נשים וגברים בדיון ההלכתי יביא למיתון של או תיקון של הכללים בצורה שתהיה מתאימה לשני המגדרים.
תודה.
Adina. Yeah. Adina, is it Adina? Okay. You need to unmute yourself.
Okay. Thank you. So, Professor Ross, you talked about the feminist critique coming from the modern Orthodox community, and most, if not all, of the people you mentioned who had led some form of the critique or protest, such as Lou Greenberg and Judith Plaskow, are American, and the modern Orthodox movement is an American movement. So I was wondering, but you talk about how it looks in the in Israel being for you being in Israel in a Jewish culture. So I was wondering if you see the communities who are engaging with the Orthodox communities engaging with the feminist critique in Israel and America as doing it in very similar ways, and or do you feel that they're very, very different?
No, I don't. I think that the differences are being eliminated with mass communication and globalization. There's a back and forth. In America, because religious life is more synagogue concentrated, and we can leave sort of general culture to the goyim, as it were, then women's learning is also not as developed there as in Israel. So American feminism or feminism outside Israel has concentrated more on political and ritual matters. And in Israel, because we need a broader kind of translation of feminism, that there are more exciting things going on here, but the two communities work very much on each other in a sort of domino effect, and I don't see them going in separate directions, quite the contrary.
Thank you. Although I'm very surprised that you say learning in the U.S. is lagging when it is common in almost all modern Orthodox high schools for girls to study Talmud, and that's only the case in very few high schools in Israel.
Yes, I'm talking more about post-high school and more advanced learning, which in Israel is snowballing all the time. At one point, people were worried that women would be encouraged to do a gap year, and that's it. but in Israel, there's very much a consciousness to create frameworks for more advanced learning, which is really growing in leaps and bounds.
Thank you very much.
Also, numbers in Israel also determine things.
Thank you very much. I would like, before I continue with the line of raised hands here, I would like to give the opportunity to the room at Van Leer, where a very fine group of distinguished scholars are sitting with Tamar, to ask a question. Professor Ben-Pazi, I understood, would like to ask something.
No, you can't see me, but it's okay. Thank you very much for your talk. That is very significant and influenced. I want to leave the question of the halakha. I want to look at the Torah. I want to talk about the language. The problem of the Hebrew language. Is there a way to overcome the problem of masculine and feminine of the Hebrew language?
I honestly doubt. And the truth is, even though I after the fact, acknowledge that attempts like Michaeli, at first I regarded as artificial, and only lately have I even adopted the habit of calling my husband Ishi or Ben-Zugi, and I stayed with the old Baal. But to a certain extent, you can't transform a language. So to a certain extent, the habit now of saying chaverim and chaverot is certainly a reflection and also a stimulus to changing attitudes, but I don't favor anything greatly radical, because Hebrew is Hebrew. What can you do?
Thank you. Shulamit, please unmute. Okay.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay. So when I've taught, I'm a historian, and when I teach students, I stress that history is inherently secular pursuit because it puts the agency of humans as the central assumption. And you're theologizing and philosophizing history, and in doing so, I would ask, how do you distinguish between the ephemeral in history and the horrific, like the Inquisition, or in the modern period, fascism, Nazism, from something intrinsically divine, which you're saying you see in feminism, unless there is something, some kernel of feminism in the Torah that is progressively being revealed in our age?
What you're asking really relates to the radical part that I spoke in the end of my theology, in which I regard talk of God machinating or influencing history as an optional narrative that we use from an insider point of view, which may or may not be corroborated by scientific fact. I separate between the two. In other words, when doing history in a secular context, I won't invoke allusions to God and divine interference, whereas where I'm talking from within, I will use this as an optional narrative, which belongs to a theistic tradition. And ultimately, I think that I am a pantheist and agree with Rav Kook, who has expressed the Jewish theism as a kind of crutch, which we need in order to receive some sort of intimation of God as all that there is. I hope I'm making myself intelligible.
I think so. We have time for maybe two more questions. One is Mira, please. Please unmute yourself, Mira.
Here we are.
Yeah.
So my question is on the notion of truth. I understand truth has been used in a very androcentric way, but why give up on the notion of truth? Why can't we say that the notion of truth that we receive has often been construed in androcentric terms, and that the job that we all have is to unmask that, is to clear away the detritus? I wonder, we don't have to go to pantheism. We can understand that our understandings of God are approximate throughout time. And then, you know, the Gula is ki'ilu, that we come closer and closer.
My ultimate
question.
Yeah, it's a good question. My ultimate vision of what we call God is a reality in which even the distinction between truth and reality loses its potency. In other words, what we're really trying to grab, but we cannot grab so long as we have a sense of ourselves as something other, is a reality in which there's no difference between subject and object, and there's no difference between truth and what is. They're all one and the same.
Mm-hmm. And thank you for the talk.
Okay, one last question.
Yeah.
Who wants to ask?
I'd like to ask.
Okay. Shira.
Yes. How does your philosophy of continuing revelation differ from the conservative movement?
The conservative movement will see new understandings as maybe I'm characterizing as displacing previous versions, whereas I will see myself as bound by previous versions, and the new context will reveal the meaning of what was before in a new light, rather than displace it or pick and choose between what is godly and what is human. I don't distinguish between the two.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, Chaverot vechaverim, I thank you so much for your participation. And mentioning it again, it was more than 200 people participating in this very beautiful and nice and rich event. I especially thank you to Professor Tamar for being willing and able and so informative to us tonight, here in Israel at least. I thank you all for participating. I hope you will be with us for next year's annual lecture again. But tonight I'm just saying thank you to everybody who was here. Yeah, maybe you can raise your hands and give applause to Professor Ross again. Thank you very, very much. Good night. Have a good day in the US, a good night in Israel, and I hope to see you again soon at Bar-Ilan University. Thank you very much to everybody.
Thank you.